The term Golden Age of Piracy, or the Golden Age of Piracy, designates a historical period which extends approximately from the end of the 17th century to the first third of the 18th century, often situated between 1650 and 1730. This relatively short period of time has marked the collective imagination as the apogee of the great maritime pirates. It was during this period that legendary figures such as Blackbeard, Calico Jack and Bonny and Bartholomew Roberts, whose exploits and atrocities continue to fuel modern stories and fictions. But what exactly does the Golden Age mean? This term does not mean that pirates lived in opulence or enjoyed unlimited prosperity. On the contrary, the life of buccaneers was harsh, perilous, and often short. The word golden rather refers to ahistorical intensity. This is the period when piracy was most visible, active, and feared in the oceans, particularly in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. The sea routes, vital to European colonial empires, were constantly threatened by rebel crews challenging the established powers. To understand this golden age, we must place events in their historical context. At the end of the 17th century, Europe was emerging from prolonged wars between great powers. Thousands of sailors and soldiers, suddenly unemployed, found themselves on their own. Many turned to piracy, seeking their fortune on the seas by attacking merchant ships laden with gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, and slaves. Moreover, the vast colonial territories of the Caribbean and the Americas were still poorly controlled by European authorities. Entire areas escaped the established order, offering pirates strategic refuges such as Tortuga, Port Royal, or Nassau. Piracy also occurred during a period of global economic expansion. The trade routes linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas carried considerable wealth, but they remained fragile and vulnerable. For seasoned and desperate sailors, these routes represented an unexpected opportunity to plunder and redistribute these treasures. So why does this era continue to fascinate us today? Because piracy, beyond its brutality, conveys an image of rebellion against the established order. Pirates, often from humble and marginalized backgrounds, challenged kings, merchants, and empires. They created their own codes, sometimes practiced a form of democracy on board, and shared the spoils relatively equally. In a world dominated by rigid hierarchies, this organization helped forge the myth of the pirate as a symbol of freedom. Finally, the Golden Age of Piracy left a lasting mark on the popular culture. Adventure novels, Hollywood films, video games and series continue to transform these criminals into romantic heroes, often closer to the charismatic anti-hero than the bloodthirsty bandit. Between historical reality and magnified legend, piracy still embodies this unique blend of violence, mystery, and adventure. It is this journey through history between documented facts and popular myths that we will undertake by retracing the entire Golden Age of Piracy. Origins of piracy. Piracy, far from being a simple criminal activity that arose spontaneously on the seas, has deep roots in the history of European maritime expansion. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it emerged directly from the corsair system and the geopolitical context of colonial rivalries. The transformation of legal sailors into outlaws reflected the changing needs of maritime powers and the impact of global economic changes, particularly the establishment of the great transatlantic shipping routes. European privateers and letters of marque. From the end of the Middle Ages and especially from the 16th century onwards, European kingdoms with large maritime fleets, Spain, France, England, the United Provinces, used privateers to weaken their rivals. The privateer is not a pirate. He acts with a letter of marque, an official document issued by a sovereign authority. This text grants it the right to capture, plunder, and sell enemy ships in the context of a war. In exchange, a share of the booty is paid to the royal treasury, and privateering becomes fully integrated into the military strategies of states. Thus, figures like Francis Drake in England or Jean Bart in France are celebrated as national heroes, even though their methods, looting cargo, attacking coastal towns, and harassing trade routes, are hardly different from those of pirates. The distinction lies solely in the legitimacy conferred by the state. In times of conflict, this system allowed European powers to multiply their naval forces without directly assuming the costs of maintaining a fleet. The end of the colonial wars and unemployed sailors. However, this massive use of privateers posed a structural problem. Their activity depended entirely on the existence of maritime wars. However, at the turn of the 18th century, a series of treaties put an end to certain major colonial confrontations. Peace of Utrecht, 1713, which ended the War of the Spanish Succession, is a major example. It reorganized the division of the colonies and established a period of relative stability in Europe. For thousands of sailors accustomed to living from privateering, Peace meant sudden loss of their livelihoods. Governments revoked the letters of marque, depriving these men of a legal framework. Many found themselves without work, especially as the Royal Navies reduced their numbers. These experienced sailors, often young and hardened by years of combat, had few alternatives. Some returned to trade or fishing, but many chose a more lucrative path: piracy. The transition from privateer to independent pirate. The line between privateer and pirate was already blurred, so the transition was natural. The same navigational, naval combat and prize management techniques were reused. The essential difference now lay in the absence of political legitimacy. The pirate acted for his own profit, against all flags. In some cases, former privateers simply refused to acknowledge the end of their mission. Accustomed to attacking the Spanish or Portuguese, they continued their raids illegally. Others, deprived of employers, joined pirate crews that formed in areas of high commercial activity. This is how emblematic figures such as Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, or Henry Jennings, a privateer who became a pirate in the Caribbean after 1713, emerged. This collective evolution gave birth to what is often called the Golden Age of Piracy, is almost equal to 1715 to 1730. The importance of transatlantic trade routes. The choice of the Atlantic as the main theater of operations was not accidental. The discovery of America and the colonization of the Antilles, Spanish America and the African coast had created a global trading system of an unprecedented scale. Three major flows dominated: gold and silver convoys from Mexico and Peru to Spain. These treasures were prime targets, although heavily protected by Spanish fleets. The trade in colonial goods, sugar, coffee, cocoa, tobacco, cotton, transported from the Antilles and America to Europe. These cargoes, less guarded than precious metals, represented a continuous windfall for pirates. The slave trade, ships transported slaves from Africa to the Americas, then returned to Europe loaded with colonial goods. Each stopover offered opportunities for attack. The transatlantic routes thus formed a dense network, frequented by ships rich in cargo and often poorly defended. The obligatory passage areas, the Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, the approaches to the Azores or the Canaries, became strategic havens. Furthermore, some European colonies such as Nassau and the Bahamas or Jamaica served as fallback bases. Local governors, sometimes corrupt or eager to profit indirectly from the spoils, turned a blind eye to the presence of pirates. These semi-legal spaces facilitated the survival of the phenomenon. Piracy did not arise from a legal vacuum or a sudden surge of maritime violence. It is rooted in a specific context: the end of the privateering system, a direct consequence of European colonial wars. The demobilization of thousands of sailors, combined with the existence of an extraordinarily rich transatlantic trade, created the ideal conditions for the flourishing of independent piracy. From heroes legitimized by their sovereign, the corsairs transformed into feared outlaws. But behind this metamorphosis lies the continuity of a maritime system deeply linked to colonial rivalries and the development of global trade. It is this close link between imperial politics, global economy, and social marginalization that explains the emergence and growth of piracy in the Atlantic at the beginning of the 18th century. To understand the rise of piracy during the Golden Age, it is essential to delve into the geopolitical and economic context of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. For while pirates left their mark on this period, they would never have prospered without the broader backdrop of imperial rivalries, emerging global trade, and the imbalance between colossal wealth and limited means to protect it. Globe showing Europe-Africa-European colonial expansion. Since the end of the 15th century, the great European powers have embarked on eras for colonization. Spain, a pioneer with Christopher Columbus and the conquest of vast territories in Central and South America, quickly amassed immense fortunes thanks to the gold and silver mines of Mexico and Peru. Entire fleets, loaded with precious ingots, regularly crossed the Atlantic to reach Seville or Cadiz. These cargoes were real floating targets for anyone who dared to attack them. Other nations have won against Spain. England, which established colonies in North America, Virginia, New England, Carolina, and in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados. France, present in particular in Santo Domingo, future Haiti, in Martinique and in Guadeloupe, as well as in North America with New France. The Netherlands, powerful maritime traders who controlled Curaçao, Aruba and enclaves in Asia and Africa. These colonial empires regularly entered into war against each other, transforming the Atlantic and the Caribbean into a gigantic maritime battlefield. Every peace treaty or declaration of war could transform a licensed privateer into a hunted pirate. This unstable climate favored the emergence of men ready to do anything to take advantage of the weaknesses and rivalries between powers. Anchor the triangular trade. At the heart of this system was the triangular trade, the real engine of the global economy at the time. Its operation was simple but terribly effective. From Europe, ships left loaded with manufactured products: weapons, textiles, tools, alcohol, glass beads. In Africa, these goods were exchanged for enslaved captives, supplied by local kingdoms or merchants specializing in the trade. Towards the Americas, these slaves were transported in atrocious conditions, crammed into the holds during the famous Middle Crossing. In the American and Caribbean colonies, slaves worked on plantations, producing sugar, tobacco, cotton, coffee or cocoa, which were then shipped back to Europe. This cycle, repeated endlessly, generated colossal profits. But it also had a direct consequence. It multiplied the sea routes laden with riches, crossed by ships often poorly armed and vulnerable to attack. For a pirate, every merchant ship was an opportunity. Moneybag economic engines: gold, silver, sugar, tobacco and slaves. The most coveted cargoes were not limited to precious metals. While Spanish gold and silver represented an incomparable boon, other products fueled the thirst for wealth. Sugar, the true white gold of the time, cultivated massively in the Caribbean, constituted a gigantic market in Europe. Tobacco, exported from Virginia and the West Indies, had become a highly prized luxury product. Coffee and cocoa, still rare, were enjoying growing success among European elites. African slaves, despite being human beings reduced to merchandise, represented an enormous commercial value. A ship carrying several hundred captives constituted a highly profitable target for pirates, who could resell their cargo in intolerant or corrupt ports. Each merchant ship thus became a floating mine, condensing the inequalities and excesses of the colonial economy. Pirate flagged the weakening of naval control. Despite the importance of this trade, European powers did not always have the necessary means to effectively protect their maritime routes. Several factors explain this vulnerability. Insufficient fleets: the British Royal Navy or the Spanish Armada were formidable in wartime, but were spread across vast oceans. Many areas remained poorly patrolled. Distant colonies: the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, or the African coasts were difficult to control from Europe. Communications took months. Local corruption in some colonial ports: governors turned a blind eye to pirate activity, or even collaborated with them in exchange for a share of the booty. Nassau, in particular, became a pirate haven tolerated by authorities unable to dislodge them. The end of wars: after each conflict, thousands of dismissed sailors, accustomed to legal plunder as privateers, found themselves unemployed. Many then turned to piracy. These gaps created an ideal environment for pirates. Where merchant ships carried fortunes but lacked defenses, they moved in small, fast and agile units, striking by surprise. A world out of balance. In short, the world of the late 17th and early 18th centuries was marked by a deep imbalance. On the one hand, colonial empires amassing unprecedented wealth. On the other, thousands of men on the margins of this world order, ready to pounce on vulnerable cargoes. Piracy was born and flourished precisely in this space left free by the great powers, between the insatiable thirst for riches and the inability to effectively protect these treasures. It was not simply an isolated crime. It constituted a savage reaction to the excesses of colonial trade and a symptom of the immense economic transformation that the world was experiencing. It was in this context, an ocean saturated with merchant ships, insufficient surveillance, endemic corruption, and a multitude of sailors with no future, that the Golden Age of Piracy took off. The beginnings of the Golden Age of Piracy, 1650 to 1680. The history of piracy has several phases, but what we call the Golden Age truly opens in the second half of the 17th century. Between the years 1650 and 1680, a particular generation of pirates, called buccaneers, dominated the Caribbean and systematically attacked the Spanish Empire. This founding moment marked the transition from the privateer, still officially linked to a state, to the independent pirate, while laying the foundations for the romantic myth of piracy that persists to this day. The context: a weakened Spanish Empire. Since the conquest of Mexico and Peru in the 16th century, Spain has built up the largest colonial empire in the world, fueled by shipments of gold and silver from the Americas. But from the 17th century onwards, several factors weakened its dominance. The other European powers, England, France, United Provinces, contested its colonial monopoly. The Spanish sea routes are long, difficult to defend and depend on seasonal convoys, the famous Silver Fleet. The European wars mobilized a large part of the Royal Navy, reducing the surveillance capacity in the West Indies. In this context, the Caribbean islands became an economic and military battlefield. Spain's weakness attracted numerous adventurers, privateers and then pirates, coming mainly from England and France, but also from the United Provinces. The emergence of the buccaneers. The term filibuster probably comes from Dutch buccaneer, free plunderer, which also gave the English word freebooter. It first refers to the adventurers who settled in the Caribbean islands, living from hunting, fishing and raids against Spanish ships. The buccaneers find refuge in strategic locations, often beyond the direct control of the great powers. Tortoise, off the coast of Haiti, semi-official French colony which becomes a major base of operations. Jamaica, conquered by the English in 1655, it was transformed into a den of corsairs and pirates operating against the Spanish. Its capital, Port Royal, becomes one of the richest and most corrupt ports in the New World. Santo Domingo, French part of Haiti, growing anchorage point for French adventurers, particularly in the second half of the century. These bases provided buccaneers with a haven to resell their loot, recruit crews and maintain their ships. They often operated with the tacit complicity of colonial governors, who themselves profited from the riches plundered from the Spanish. The culture of the buccaneers. Filibusters are not only looters, but also relatively organized communities. They establish codes of conduct, called Articles of the Filibuster, which regulate the distribution of loot, compensation in the event of injury, and discipline on board. Their way of life attracted unemployed sailors, deserters, European adventurers, but also escaped slaves or indentured workers. Crews were therefore often cosmopolitan and based on a form of relative equality. The captain was elected, and each received a proportional share of the booty. This system contrasts with the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navies and contributes to the prestige of the pirate lifestyle among the maritime working classes. Emblematic figures, Henry Morgan and François L'Olonnais. Two personalities particularly embody this first generation of buccaneers. Henry Morgan, 1635–1688. A Welshman in the service of England, Henry Morgan became one of the most feared privateers in the Caribbean. Based in Port Royal, he led several daring expeditions against the Spanish, initially benefiting from letters of marque issued by the governor of Jamaica. In 1668 he attacked Portobello, Panama, one of the richest ports of the Spanish Empire. Its spectacular capture shocked Europe and considerably enriched its men. In 1671 he launched a gigantic raid against Panama City, crossing the isthmus at the head of several hundred men. Although this operation took place while England and Spain were officially at peace, Morgan emerged covered in booty and glory. Rather than being punished, he was eventually knighted and appointed Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, a testament to the pragmatism of the English authorities who tolerated piracy when it served their interests. François L'Olonnais, 1630–1671. A darker figure, the Frenchman François L'Olonnais embodies the brutality of the buccaneers. Based in Tortuga, he acquired a bloodthirsty reputation by mercilessly massacring his Spanish prisoners. He attacks successively Maracaibo and Gibraltar, Venezuela, sowing terror among the Spanish colonists. His extreme cruelty earned him the nickname, Scourge of the Spaniards. His career ended tragically. Captured by Indians in the Isthmus of Darien, he was reportedly executed and dismembered. Despite this violent end, his name remains associated with the terror that buccaneers inspired in the Spanish. The Great Attacks against the Spanish Empire. Between 1650 and 1680, the buccaneers launched a series of spectacular raids against Spanish cities and ports, revealing the vulnerability of the empire. Santo Domingo, 1655 English attempt, before the conquest of Jamaica. Portobello, 1668, Henry Morgan symbol of Spanish colonial wealth. Maracaibo and Gibraltar, 1667 François L'Olonnais. Panama City, 1671, Henry Morgan, one of the greatest pirate raids of the century. These attacks, carried out by crews of only a few hundred men, had a disproportionate impact. They temporarily paralyzed Spanish trade, sowed panic in the colonies and accelerated the decline of Spanish hegemony in the region. The end of a phase. By the late 1670s, colonial powers were beginning to gain greater control over their possessions. Spain was strengthening its convoys, while France and England were seeking to normalize diplomatic relations. Gradually, privateers and buccaneers were either integrated into official colonial structures, like Morgan, or persecuted as criminals. This first wave of organized piracy, however, foreshadowed the next. For while the buccaneers were still tied at least partially to the great powers, their successors at the beginning of the 18th century, Blackbeard, Charles Vane and Calico Jack, conducted their activities completely independently. Between 1650 and 1680, the Caribbean buccaneers lay the foundations for the Golden Age of Piracy. Taking advantage of Spanish weakness and the implicit support of the English and French colonies, they established a way of life that was at once adventurous, violent, and egalitarian. The figures of Henry Morgan and François L'Olonnais symbolize the two faces of this period: audacity rewarded by the powerful on the one hand and limitless cruelty on the other. By attacking the great Spanish strongholds, these pirates demonstrated the vulnerability of a colonial empire too vast to defend and opened the way to the explosion of piracy at the beginning of the 18th century. The height of piracy. If we had to identify the most significant moment in the history of piracy, it would undoubtedly be the period between 1690 and 1720 inches, the space of a few decades. Piracy went from a marginal activity to a truly global phenomenon, disrupting maritime trade and leaving a lasting mark on the collective imagination. This was the era of legendary names, spectacular naval battles, and the emergence of real pirate republics, beyond the reach of the authority of kings and empires. Waterwave, a period of transition, from corsairs to pirates. At the end of the great European wars, thousands of sailors and privateers found themselves unemployed. They had learned to maneuver ships, handle weapons and attack enemy convoys. But with the signing of peace treaties, their letters of marque, these official authorizations that allowed them to plunder in the name of their king, lost all value. Many did not accept returning to a poor life as fishermen or dock workers. They therefore continued their activities but on their own account, becoming pirates in the strict sense. This transition gave rise to a generation of hardened sailors, without political ties, ready to attack Spanish, English or French ships, provided they were carrying riches. Desert island pirate bases, Nassau and beyond. To prosper, pirates needed safe havens where they could repair their ships, resell their loot and recruit new men. This is how several bases became famous. Nassau, Bahamas, probably the most emblematic hideout. The small island, difficult for warships to access, became a veritable pirate republic in 1715. The local authorities, unable to control the region, let it happen. Nassau sometimes sheltered several hundred pirates, forming a cosmopolitan community where the English, French, freed Africans, and even a few Native Americans rubbed shoulders. Madagascar, in the Indian Ocean, served as a base for many pirates operating on the routes linking India, Africa and Europe. The wealth of the East India Company's trade made it an ideal target. Tortoise, already famous since the 17th century, continued to play a role, just like Port Royal in Jamaica before its destruction by an earthquake in 1692. These hideouts were not just refuges. They functioned as real alternative micro-societies, beyond the control of colonial kings and governors. Nassau in particular symbolizes this unique experience. A society of men and women living on the margins of the established order, sharing spoils, responsibilities and dangers. Pirate flag, the legendary figures of the heyday. It was during this period that the most famous pirates in history, their names still resonate today, so spectacular and sometimes bloody were their adventures. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, probably the most legendary pirate. With his braided black beard into which he inserted flaming wicks, he sowed terror just by his appearance. At the head of the Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French warship captured, he imposed his law in the Caribbean and on the east coast of North America. His reputation was based as much on his charisma as on his psychological strategy. He often preferred to make his victims surrender without a fight, cultivating an image of an invincible ogre. Calico Jack Rackham, less feared than Blackbeard, he remains famous for his distinctive flag, two crossed sabers under a skull, and above all for having sailed alongside two legendary female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Anne Bonny et Mary Read, these two women defy all the conventions of their time. Dressed as men to participate in battles, they fought ferociously and equaled their male companions in bravery. Their story, filled with passion, battles and tragedy, illustrates the diversity and complexity of the pirate world. Charles Vane, known for his violent temper and his opposition to all forms of authority, even among pirates. He refused to benefit from the royal pardon offered by England in 1718, preferring to continue to challenge warships. Bartholomew Roberts, dit Black Bart. Less well known to the general public but feared in his time, he captured more than 400 ships in just a few years. Elegant and charismatic, he illustrates the almost military dimension that large-scale piracy could take. These characters, each in their own way, contributed to forging the Black Legend pirates, a mixture of adventure, violence and freedom. Balance scale, internal organization, a democracy at sea. An often overlooked but essential aspect of this period is the internal organization of pirate crews. Unlike the royal or merchant navies, where discipline was brutal and hierarchical, pirates operated according to surprisingly democratic rules. Election of the captain. Captains were chosen by the crew and could be dismissed if they failed to perform. The captain only had absolute power during combat. Outside of combat, important decisions were made collectively. Sharing the spoils. The seized riches were distributed according to a precise scale, written in a pirate code. Each sailor received a share, often higher than that of a merchant marine. The captain, contrary to popular belief, received only a slightly higher share. Compensation for injuries. The codes provided compensation for injured or maimed pirates, a rudimentary system of social insurance that did not exist elsewhere at the time. Rules of life. Crews established strict rules prohibiting, for example, armed disputes on board or excessive gambling. These rules ensured the cohesion of a group living in difficult conditions. This organization reinforced the feeling of fraternity and equality. In a world dominated by social inequalities and absolute monarchies, pirate ships represented a form of radical counter-society, where even freed slaves could become full members. The Jolly Roger and its symbolism. Perhaps one of the most well-known symbols of piracy is the Jolly Roger, this black flag bearing a skull and crossbones. In the modern imagination, it has become the universal emblem of pirates. Historically, the Jolly Roger did exist, but it was neither uniform nor systematic. Each captain could create his own flag, often to impress or terrorize his opponents. Some displayed an hourglass as a reminder that time is running out, while others depicted dancing skeletons or bladed weapons. Black generally symbolized a demand for surrender without a fight, while red signified that no mercy would be shown. So the Jolly Roger was not just a flag. It was a psychological tool, designed to force enemy ships to surrender before the first cannon shot. Fear was the pirate's most effective weapon. Buried treasures, a persistent myth. If there is one unmissable cliché, it is that of the buried treasure. Popular stories tell of pirates digging up chests full of gold and drawing mysterious maps marked with a large X. The reality is quite different. Pirates generally spent their loot quickly on alcohol, gambling, or by trading it for food and supplies for their ships. Stolen wealth circulated quickly. It was shared equally among crew members and rarely hoarded. The myth of buried treasure owes much to literature, particularly to the novel Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, published in 1883. This immensely popular book crystallized in the collective imagination the idea of the hidden chest and treasure hunting. But in reality, there is very little evidence that pirates practiced this kind of concealment, with the exception of rare isolated cases. Parrots and wooden legs. Another recurring image, that of the pirate with a parrot on his shoulder, a hook for a hand and a creaking wooden leg. These stereotypes do have a historical basis, but they have been enormously amplified by fiction. Sailors of the time, pirates or not, could lose limbs due to combat or diseases like scurvy. Some used rudimentary prosthetics, but this remained rare. As for parrots, it is true that these exotic birds were captured in tropical colonies and brought back to Europe as curiosities. It is therefore not impossible that some pirates owned them, but certainly not to the point of making it a general trait. These images are mainly inherited from 19th century literature, then taken up by cinema. The character of Long John Silver, a one-eyed, one-armed pirate accompanied by a parrot, in Treasure Island, has left a lasting mark on popular culture. From this came this caricatured representation, immediately recognizable but far removed from reality. Books. Literary fiction and its exaggerations. Most of the stereotypes related to piracy come from the literary fiction. The 18th century had already popularized sensationalist stories, such as the famous Chronicle of Captain Charles Johnson, a general history of the pirates published in 1724. This book, halfway between testimony and novel, already fixed certain clichés by exaggerating the personalities and adventures of the pirates. But it was especially in the 19th century with Stevenson and other adventure writers, that the figure of the romantic pirate, rum-drinking, treasure-map-loving and free as the wind, took hold. These stories transformed violent criminals into adventure hero, sometimes almost friendly. Cinema, from the 20th century onwards, further amplified this gap. From Hollywood films to modern sagas such as Pirates of the Caribbean, piracy has become a world of fantasy, where historical danger and brutality give way to humor, romance and epic action. Balance scale between real violence and golden legend. It's important to remember that the reality of piracy was far less glamorous. Living conditions on board were harsh: lack of clean water, disease, overcrowding, and harsh discipline. Attacks could be brutal, battles bloody, and prisoners were rarely spared. However, the contrast between this dark reality and the embellished legend, the subsequent history of piracy, explains why it continues to fascinate. It embodies both the raw violence of history and a romantic ideal of freedom and adventure. Myth and reality, a lasting alchemy. Ultimately, the vision we have of pirates today is a mixture of historical truths and literary myths. The Jolly Roger was indeed a symbol of terror, but it didn't always resemble the flag we know. Buried treasure is almost entirely fictional. Parrots, peg legs, and hooks were exceptions, transformed into archetypes by literature and film. This fusion of history and legend explains why piracy still exerts such evocative power. It speaks to us as much about the brutality of a merciless maritime world as it does about an ideal of rebellion and freedom that belongs to the imagination. Cultural and symbolic heritage of piracy. Although the Golden Age of Piracy ended in the early 18th century, its impact on the collective imagination remains considerable. Pirates, real historical figures, have gradually transformed into mythical characters, alternately feared, admired, or idealized. From Enlightenment literature to Hollywood cinema, including modern video games, the image of the pirate has been constantly reshaped. More than just a historical memory, it has become a universal symbol of freedom, adventure, and rebellion. Piracy in literature, from Daniel Defoe to Stevenson. The first dissemination of the pirate imagination was through writing. From the 18th century onwards, travel stories, logs, and chronicles of popular trials fueled the curiosity of the European public. Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe, 1719, also published in 1724, a general history of the pirates, sometimes attributed to him, sometimes to a certain Captain Charles Johnson. This work brings together fictionalized biographies of famous figures such as Blackbeard and Bonny and Calico Jack. A mixture of true facts and inventions, this text long-term fixed a large part of pirate imagery: black flags, buried treasure, egalitarian maritime republics. It constitutes one of the foundations of the modern myth. Robert Louis Stevenson. In the 19th century, Stevenson gave the pirate a literary aura with Treasure Island, 1883. The character of Long John Silver becomes the archetype of the cunning and charismatic pirate. Stevenson popularizes emblematic elements: the treasure map, the wooden leg, the parrot on the shoulder. The literature of Stevenson and Defoe has a lasting influence on the way piracy is represented in Western culture. Representation in film and video games. Cinema and video games have amplified the pirate myth, making it accessible and spectacular for a global audience. At the cinema, pirates are first heroized in adventure films like Captain Blood, 1935. But the saga Pirates of the Caribbean, 2003 to 2017, embodies the modern reinvention of the pirate. Jack Sparrow is at once cunning, unpredictable, and marginal. The films popularize a blend of action, humor, and fantasy that reinforces the image of the pirate as an emblematic figure of adventure and freedom. In video games, titles like Sid Meier's Pirates or Assassin's Creed 4, Black Flag offer the player an immersive experience of pirate life. In Black Flag, Edward Kenway sails through an open world, plundering, exploring, and challenging colonial authorities, reinforcing the idea of individual freedom and rebellion. Video games thus extend the pirate legend into the contemporary imagination and allow direct interaction with these mythologized historical figures. The pirate as a symbol of freedom and rebellion. Piracy is seen not only as a criminal activity, but also as a model of freedom outside the rules imposed by empires and hierarchical societies. Individual freedom pirates are often depicted as men and women who chose to live outside the social order, according to their own rules. Codes of conduct and articles of buccaneering, organizing collective life on board, and the equitable distribution of booty, fueled the idea that pirates practiced a form of maritime democracy. Rebellion against authority. Piracy symbolizes the challenge to laws, kings, and trading companies. It embodies a form of resistance, sometimes romantic, to power structures and inspires later cultural and political movements, from anarchism to the contemporary libertarian spirit. Popular hero. Despite their violence, pirates are portrayed as close to the people and opposed to the elites. This perception contributes to their image as heroes of the social margins, seduced by their audacity and independence. Lasting impact on the collective imagination. The influence of piracy extends beyond literature and entertainment. Pirates are ubiquitous in modern popular culture. Children's literature and stories, treasures, mysterious maps and naval battles continue to fuel stories for children and adolescents. Theater and music. Pirates appear as comic or adventurous figures, with immediately recognizable dress and language codes. Digital culture. Pirate vocabulary inspires the digital world. Computer hacking takes up the notion of transgression of rules and freedom outside established frameworks. The image of the pirate as a rebellious and free adventurer has thus spanned the centuries, from historical reality to popular fiction. Even though 17th-century pirates were feared criminals, they became the heroes of a worldwide legend, embodying absolute freedom and a rejection of social constraint. The cultural and symbolic legacy of piracy shows how history can be transformed into myth. From Defoe to Stevenson, from Hollywood to video games, pirates have become universal icons, figures of rebellion, charismatic adventurers, and symbols of freedom. Their black ensign still flies in the collective imagination, a reminder that piracy, though long gone, continues to captivate and inspire generations. Summary of the main stages. The story begins at the end of the 17th century, when European colonial expansion and the triangular trade created fertile ground for piracy. Gold, silver, sugar, and slaves circulated across the Atlantic, but the colonial powers struggled to control their ships and ports. Pirates then emerged as opportunists, taking advantage of the weakness of naval control to seize wealth. Late of piracy between 1690 and 1720 saw the proliferation of pirate bases, such as Nassau in the Bahamas or Madagascar. Legendary figures emerged: Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard and Bonny, Mary Red, Charles Vane, and Calico Jack. The crews were distinguished by a surprisingly democratic organization, sharing the spoils and respecting a strict internal code, often more equitable than the traditional naval hierarchy. At the same time, the popular culture and literary narratives began to create the romantic image of the pirate. The Jolly Roger, buried treasure, parrots on the shoulder, and peg legs became universal symbols. Yet the historical reality is much more nuanced. Pirates spent their riches quickly, buried treasure was scarce, and life on board was harsh, marked by disease, violence, and precarious conditions. Then comes the decline in the early 1720s. The colonial powers intensified repression. Naval patrols, systematic pursuits, and public executions like that of Bartholomew Roberts in 1722. The Caribbean and trade routes became secure, and survivors had to choose between returning to a lawful life, accepting royal pardons, or continuing to sail in an increasingly hostile world. Within a few years, organized piracy disappeared, but it left behind a powerful cultural heritage. Balance scale: real historical significance versus fictionalized legacy. The Golden Age of Piracy played a significant role in maritime and economic history. Pirates disrupted trade, tested the limits of colonial powers, and influenced how European nations organized their naval security. The social structures they developed aboard their ships, fair divisions of plunder, codes of conduct, and captain elections, represent a unique social experience, which contrasts sharply with the strict hierarchies of the Royal Marines. However, our modern view of piracy is largely romanticized and publicized. Literature, theater, film, and video games have amplified certain traits to create instantly recognizable archetypes. The modern pirate is at once a free-spirited adventurer, a charismatic rebel, and a figure of enigma and danger, a cultural construct that far exceeds historical reality. This distinction is crucial. It reminds us that real history, with its economic, political, and human stakes, is often more complex than myth. But myth has its value. It stimulates the imagination, inspires creativity, and keeps alive the memory of this fascinating period. Waterwave closing message: connecting history and modern fascination. What makes the Golden Age of Piracy so fascinating today is not just the violence or audacity of the pirates, but the freedom that they symbolize in a strictly hierarchical world. These men and women of the sea created their own rules, chose their destiny, and lived on the fringes of established societies. Even though their real lives were short and dangerous, their image has survived through the centuries. Piracy reminds us that history is not just a succession of dates and battles. It is also a fertile ground for the imagination. Pirates, with their codes, exploits, and legends, continue to fuel fiction and popular culture, while remaining anchored in the reality of a harsh and merciless maritime world. As we conclude this video, it is fascinating to note that pirates have never completely disappeared. They still live on in stories, films, games, and even in the minds of those who dream of adventure and freedom on the oceans. Understanding their real history enriches our understanding of piracy while allowing us to savor the myth that has crossed the centuries. If you enjoyed exploring the thrilling world of the Golden Age of Piracy, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments. Which pirate legend fascinates you the most? Dive deeper into history with us and let the adventure continue on the high seas.